They believed the beaches were their gateway to victory, safe, secure, and ready to be taken. But what met them was something no training could prepare for, a deadly trap designed to break their spirit in the first terrifying moments. This is the story of a landing that changed everything, forever. The night air was thick with a mix of salt and diesel fumes as thousands of soldiers settled into the cramped landing craft, the gentle rocking of the English Channel beneath them a stark contrast to the storm of violence that awaited on the shores of Normandy. It was the night of June 5, 1944, and the largest amphibious assault ever attempted in human history was quietly unfolding under a cloak of darkness. The men aboard these vessels were a blend of seasoned veterans and fresh recruits, their faces etched with a mixture of steely resolve and quiet apprehension. Some clutched letters from loved ones, others silently reviewed their training, and many simply stared ahead, trying to imagine the hell they were about to enter. General Dwight D. Eisenhower had given the order. Operation Overlord was underway. Despite months of preparation and rehearsals, the weight of the task pressed down on every man like the heavy fog that rolled in from the sea. The soldiers knew the beaches would not be welcoming. They had heard the reports. German defenses were formidable, deeply entrenched, and ruthlessly efficient. Yet confidence remained. Briefings had painted a picture of overwhelming Allied firepower and carefully coordinated timing, promising a landing that, while dangerous, could be executed with precision. As the landing craft sliced through the waves, the coastline ahead seemed deceptively calm, and eerie stillness masked the reality that lay just beyond the horizon. The Normandy coast was a fortress, painstakingly constructed by the Germans over years under the name of the Atlantic Wall. Mines, barbed wire, wooden stakes, and steel hedgehogs waited beneath the water, while bunkers bristled with machine guns and artillery. Every inch of that beach was designed to kill. Yet, from this distance, it looked almost peaceful, as if the morning mist might simply part to reveal a welcoming shore. Inside the landing craft, the tension was palpable but silent. Conversations were sparse, voices were lowered to whispers or absent altogether. The rhythmic slap of waves against the hull mixed with the distant rumble of naval bombardment, a steady reminder that this was no ordinary crossing. Soldiers gripped their weapons tightly, some fumbling with their gear, others lost in thought. The cold seeped through their uniforms, making fingers stiff and breath visible in the night air. Each man wrestled with his own fears, some haunted by the possibility of death, others by leaving behind family and friends. Yet, despite the anxiety, there was a shared sense of purpose. They were part of something monumental, a turning point in the war that could not be ignored. As the hours slipped by, the landing craft drew closer to the shore, and the silhouettes of Normandy's beaches became clearer against the faint lightening sky. The men could make out the gentle slopes of the dunes, and the shadowy forms of the German fortifications. It was a chilling sight. Some whispered prayers, others steeled themselves with grim determination. The commanders on board issued final reminders, reinforcing the plan: storm the beach, break through the defenses, and secure the exits to allow the follow-on forces to pour inland. Yet beneath these orders lay a sobering truth: no plan survives first contact intact. The soldiers were about to find out that what lay ahead was far more perilous than even the darkest of their imaginings. The German defenders were alert and prepared. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, charged with strengthening the Atlantic Wall, had foreseen the possibility of an invasion and had pushed for formidable defensive measures. Coastal batteries bristled with heavy artillery, and infantry units manned fortified positions with clear fields of fire across the beaches. The rough waters and unpredictable tides only added to the danger, threatening to scatter the landing craft and disrupt timing. The beach was a trap, a funnel designed to concentrate the attacking forces into kill zones where machine guns and mortars could wreak havoc. From their distant vantage point, the Allied soldiers could not see the full extent of the German network, nor the deadly obstacles lurking beneath the waves. As the first hints of dawn tinged the horizon, the atmosphere inside the landing craft grew heavier. Men adjusted their helmets and checked their weapons one last time, the faces around them ghostly in the dim light. Some exchanged final words, a quiet camaraderie born of shared fate. The engine slowed as the crafts approached the shallows, and the waiting began. It was a pause filled with the sharp scent of salt, oil, and a tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. The moment before the ramp dropped, the moment before chaos erupted, was a crucible of fear and focus. Then came the signal. The ramp dropped. The war exploded. The illusion of a safe landing shattered instantly. What was meant to be a swift, organized assault quickly descended into confusion and terror. Machine gun fire tore through the air, ricocheting off the beach and sending men sprawling into the sand and surf. Explosions tore through landing craft still trying to reach the shore. Soldiers were thrown into the cold, churning water, fighting to stay afloat amid debris and the bodies of comrades. The carefully laid plans unraveled under the brutal reality of the German defense. The beach was no gentle welcome. It was a battlefield soaked with fear, blood, and noise. In those first moments, it became clear that the idea of a safe landing was nothing more than a dangerous illusion. The men fighting to reach the shore faced not just enemy fire but the raw chaos of war itself, disorientation, loss of command, and the brutal challenge of surviving long enough to push forward. The calm coastline was a cruel mask, hiding a hellish landscape where every step forward came at a staggering cost. Yet, amid the devastation, the determination to hold the line and secure the beach had begun to take root. This was only the beginning. The cost would be high, the struggle relentless, but the invasion would move forward, shaped by the grit and sacrifice of the men who refused to be stopped. In these dark, desperate hours before dawn, the men crossing the channel did not know what awaited them in full. They only knew that history demanded their courage, and that the world would never be the same once the first wave of Operation Overlord hit those beaches. The calm before the storm was over, and the nightmare had just begun. The night had barely surrendered to the first pale light of dawn when the skies above Normandy became a chaotic theater of war. Hundreds of aircraft churned through the cold, heavy air, disgorging paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, alongside British troops from the 6th Airborne Division, deep behind enemy lines. The soldiers spilled out into the darkness, many losing sight of their drop zones in the confusion of anti-aircraft fire, thick clouds, and swirling winds. Instead of landing neatly in assigned pockets where their objectives awaited, scattered groups found themselves isolated in unfamiliar fields, hedgerows, and small villages, often separated from radios and officers. The silence of the countryside was shattered by the distant crackle of gunfire, as German defenders quickly became aware of the invasion's true scale. For these paratroopers, the mission was no longer about precision but survival and improvisation in the thick of hostile territory. Meanwhile, below, the English Channel remained choppy and unforgiving. Rough seas lashed at the landing craft, their engines straining against currents and waves as they pushed toward the beaches. Navigation was a nightmare in the pre-dawn gloom, and many vessels drifted from their planned approach points. This was especially true on the American sectors, where strong winds and turbulent water caused landing craft to veer miles off course. Soldiers clung to their weapons and each other, fighting seasickness, cold, and the gnawing anticipation of what awaited just beyond the breakers. The minutes stretched interminably, punctuated only by the ominous boom of naval bombardments meant to soften German defenses but also to drown out the shrill cries and thunderous explosions that would soon rip through the beaches. The Normandy coastline, known to many as the Atlantic Wall, loomed ominously ahead, its reputation forged through years of Nazi engineering and preparation. The Germans had painstakingly constructed a defensive fortress meant to repel any seaborne invasion. Fields of mines lay hidden beneath the sand and surf, waiting to tear open the hulls of landing craft and shred the feet of advancing troops. Jagged steel hedgehogs and wooden stakes protruded from the water like skeletal fingers, designed to impale or immobilize any vessel that dared to land. Barbed wire and dense networks of trenches snaked across the dunes, while machine gun nests and pillboxes bristled with weapons, offering overlapping fields of fire to create lethal kill zones. Each element was calculated not just to delay but to annihilate the attackers before they could consolidate any foothold. As the landing craft approached the shore, the carefully choreographed timeline began to fracture. Signals were missed or misunderstood amid the roar of engines and artillery. Landing waves were delayed or scattered. Men found themselves disembarking in unexpected places, sometimes miles from their designated beaches. The result was chaos, a far cry from the seamless, overwhelming assault the planners had envisioned. Instead of moving forward in tightly coordinated units, soldiers were forced to navigate a shattered battlefield where every step was a gamble. The tides and currents, themselves unpredictable, further complicated movement, sometimes dragging troops into deeper water or pushing them against deadly obstacles. Amidst this unfolding disaster, the German defenders responded with ruthless efficiency. Trained to expect an assault but not its precise timing, they nonetheless unleashed devastating firepower as soon as the first silhouettes emerged from the fog. Machine guns raked the beaches, their bullets whipping through the surf and sand, tearing through men and equipment. Mortars and artillery shells exploded with deafening force, sending plumes of earth and shrapnel into the air. For many Allied soldiers, what was supposed to be a swift advance quickly became a desperate struggle to survive the initial onslaught. Some sought refuge in shallow craters or behind wrecked landing craft. Others were pinned down by withering fire, unable to move forward or retreat. Command and control frayed as officers were killed or separated from their units, forcing small groups to operate on individual initiative. The brutal geography of the beaches compounded the suffering. Steep bluffs, uneven terrain, and narrow exit points meant that even those who survived the initial landing faced new hazards. Engineers and infantrymen risked everything to clear paths through obstacles and minefields, working under constant threat of enemy fire. Every second was measured in pain and loss, as men fell to gunfire, exhaustion, or drowning in the surf. The relentless pounding of shells and the screams of the wounded formed a grim soundtrack to this crucible of warfare. The beach was no longer a line to be crossed but a deadly maze where survival depended on quick thinking, sheer will, and sometimes sheer luck. Yet amid the carnage, small pockets of resistance began to bend but not break. Soldiers, often stripped of their commanders and supplies, adapted swiftly. They used terrain to their advantage, crawling through sand dunes and shell holes, coordinating ad hoc assaults on enemy positions. Engineers cleared lanes in the barbed wire, allowing waves of reinforcements to follow. Medics moved tirelessly among the wounded, administering aid in the open despite the constant threat of death. The tide of battle slowly shifted from desperate survival to cautious advance. The beach, once a choke point designed to stop the invasion dead, was beginning to open, fragment by fragment, inch by inch. Behind the front lines, Allied commanders grappled with reports of scattered landings and mounting casualties. The carefully laid plans of Operation Overlord were being tested beyond expectations, yet the overall momentum remained. The naval bombardment continued, offering cover where it could, and airborne units that had landed off course worked to regroup and secure critical objectives inland. The morning light revealed the true scale of the operation and the daunting task still ahead. The cost of miscalculations and the brutal efficiency of the Atlantic Wall would weigh heavily in the hours and days to come. As the struggle unfolded, the men on the ground were forced to confront not just the enemy but the physical and psychological extremes of combat. Exhaustion, fear, pain, and loss intertwined in a relentless assault on mind and body. Each decision carried life or death consequences, and the fog of war obscured friend from foe, plan from reality. Yet within this chaos lay a thread of resilience, a shared commitment to the mission and to each other. It was this human element, amid the grinding machinery of war and the calculated cruelty of the German defenses, that defined the opening moments of the invasion. The initial chaos did not signal defeat, but the harsh birth of a beachhead that would become the foothold for Allied liberation of Western Europe. Though scattered and fragmented, the Allied forces began to forge a tenuous grip on the sand and soil of Normandy. The early morning landings behind enemy lines by the airborne divisions set the stage for securing roads and bridges vital to the invasion's success. Meanwhile, the battered and disoriented soldiers arriving by sea fought to establish entry points that would allow the tide of men and material to flow inland. This chapter of the invasion illustrates how even the most meticulously planned operations are vulnerable to the unpredictable realities of war. It is a story of fractured beginnings, desperate survival, and a slow, painful crawl toward footholds that would grow into victory. The chaos of the early hours belied the resolve and courage that defined the Allied effort. In the face of overwhelming defenses and nature's own challenges, these men endured, improvised, and persevered, laying the groundwork for one of the most decisive campaigns in modern history. The first light of dawn cast a pale glow over the beaches of Normandy, revealing a landscape scarred by war before the soldiers even set foot on its sand. The initial assault waves descended in a torrent, striking 5 key beaches: Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Each beach presented its own unique challenges, but none would test the resolve of the Allied forces more fiercely than Omaha. Here, American soldiers faced the brutal reality of a well-prepared, veteran German defense, entrenched and ready to unleash devastation. The 352nd Infantry Division, an experienced unit unexpectedly positioned to defend this sector, manned fortified bunkers and pillboxes, unleashing machine gun fire that tore through waves of incoming troops with merciless precision. The landing at Omaha quickly devolved into chaos. In the opening minutes, many of the division's commanding officers fell to enemy fire, shattering the chain of command. Soldiers who had trained for months to execute coordinated attacks found themselves isolated in small groups, forced to improvise under crushing pressure. The 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, supposed to operate in concert, became fragmented and scattered, each man caught in a desperate fight for survival. Without clear orders, initiative became the only currency on this hellish shoreline. Men relied on whispered commands, fleeting eye contact, and a shared instinct to push forward despite the odds. Amidst the storm of bullets and explosions, the U.S. Army's combat engineer battalions took on the grim task of clearing obstacles that turned the beach into a lethal maze. Massive metal hedgehogs, known as check hedgehogs, jutted from the sand and water, designed to pierce the hulls of landing craft and trap infantry. Barbed wire stretched like cruel veins across the dunes, while concealed mines waited silently to explode beneath advancing feet. Under relentless German fire, engineers worked methodically, dragging Bangalore torpedoes, explosive tubes meant to blast through wire and barricades, forward to clear paths. Every movement was a battle against both the enemy and the terrain itself, with the screams of the wounded mixing with the crack of rifles and the thunder of artillery. Far from the immediate carnage, the German command found itself hampered by the absence of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who was in Germany attending to family matters. This left local commanders to direct defenses amid mounting confusion, unable to fully capitalize on the initial chaos but nonetheless resolute in their resistance. Their determination was evident as German troops poured every ounce of effort into holding the beaches, aware that failure would mean the collapse of Hitler's Western Wall. Meanwhile, at Utah Beach, the situation unfolded quite differently. The 4th Infantry Division, intended to land in a specific sector, was swept 2 miles south by strong currents. This mis-landing unexpectedly placed them in a less fortified area with lighter German opposition. Taking advantage of the reduced resistance, American troops quickly established a beachhead and moved inland, linking up with paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division near the town of Sainte-Mère-Église. Their swift progress provided a critical foothold, demonstrating how fortune and quick adaptation could tip the scales even amidst the larger chaos. British and Canadian forces faced varied opposition at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. While German defenses were present, they were not as concentrated as at Omaha. Troops from the British 50th Infantry Division and Canada's 3rd Infantry Division pressed forward, gradually pushing inland through the early morning fog. Securing the city of Caen was an early objective for forces landing at Sword Beach, a key transportation hub that could facilitate further advances. However, Caen's capture proved elusive on D-Day, setting the stage for a protracted battle that would last weeks. The tide on Omaha Beach began to turn through acts of sheer grit and improvisation. One notable moment came from Sergeant Harrison Summers, whose relentless assault on the heavily defended Vierville draw helped break the German line despite staggering casualties. Small groups of soldiers, often disorganized and leaderless, began to adapt their tactics under fire. Smoke grenades provided fleeting cover from enemy sidelines, suppressive fire pinned German gunners, and coordinated charges aimed to silence pillboxes one by one. The battlefield became a mosaic of desperate assaults, each small victory a hard-won step toward establishing a beachhead. Throughout the morning, naval gunfire and airstrikes supported the landing forces, attempting to neutralize enemy positions from the sea and sky. Battleships and destroyers pumped shells onto German defenses, while fighter planes strafed and bombed suspected strongpoints. Though these efforts softened some resistance, they could not entirely eliminate the lethal network of guns that punished every advance. The price paid was visible everywhere, in the craters filled with the wounded and the dead, in the silent, haunted faces of survivors who moved forward despite exhaustion and shock. The psychological toll of the fighting became increasingly evident as hours wore on. Soldiers witnessed friends and comrades fall, many to wounds that offered little chance of survival. Fatigue settled heavily in their bones, their minds wrestling with the relentless fear and uncertainty. Yet, the imperative to hold the beachhead and secure a foothold in Nazi-occupied Europe pushed them onward. It was a relentless mental and physical battle where hope and despair coexisted, where moments of bravery emerged from the depths of human endurance. By midday, the struggle at Omaha and across the other beaches began to take shape as a tenuous but growing foothold. The battered survivors who reached the relative safety beyond the surf pushed forward to secure exits and high ground. Reinforcements continued to pour in despite the scattered landings and heavy losses. The chaos of the morning settled into a grim rhythm of advance, defense, and consolidation. The beach was no longer just a battlefield but the critical gateway to the liberation of Western Europe. This opening day of Operation Overlord was not the clean, decisive assault many had hoped for. Instead, it was a crucible of fire and blood, a test of will and improvisation under extreme conditions. The German defenses, while formidable, were not invincible, and the men who survived the initial hell forged a path forward through courage and sheer determination. The hard-won victories of these early hours laid the foundation for the campaign that would ultimately break Hitler's grip on the continent, but not without a profound cost that echoed in every grain of sand and every shattered bunker on those beaches. By evening, the beaches of Normandy bore the deep scars of the day's relentless violence. What had begun in the early hours as a chaotic, desperate gamble had evolved into a tenuous but vital foothold for the Allied forces. The beachheads, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, were secured, but far from secure. The ground was soaked not just with seawater but with the blood of more than 4,000 Allied soldiers who had been killed, wounded, or lost in the turmoil of D-Day. The cost was staggering, and every inch gained was etched in sacrifice. The victorious euphoria one might expect was tempered by exhaustion, grief, and the sobering reality that the hardest battles were yet to come. As darkness settled over the coast, the focus shifted from fighting for survival to the monumental task of sustaining the invasion. The logistical challenge was immediate and immense. Landing craft continued to ferry men, weapons, ammunition, and supplies from ships waiting just beyond the horizon. But unloading was no simple matter. The beaches were narrow and congested, and the constant threat of German artillery and mortar fire loomed. The task of moving vast quantities of material across terrain torn apart by shellfire and strewn with wreckage was daunting. The success of the entire operation depended on the Allies' ability to supply the troops already ashore and to reinforce them quickly. To address this, engineers and planners had prepared something unprecedented: the Mulberry Harbors. These temporary portable harbors, composed of massive floating roadways and artificial breakwaters, would enable ships to unload directly onto the beaches without established ports. Their construction and deployment were feats of ingenuity and necessity, vital to sustaining the fragile beachheads under fire. Crucially, the link between airborne forces dropped behind enemy lines and the seaborne troops storming the beaches began to solidify. Paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, who had fought to secure critical routes and bridges during the night, connected with units landing on Utah and Omaha beaches. This linkage was essential for controlling the major arteries inland, especially the bridges over the Murderette and Orne rivers. Holding these crossings was vital to prevent German counterattacks from cutting off the beachheads and isolating the invading forces. The scattered airborne units had endured their own hell, facing enemy patrols, confusion, and often landing far from intended drop zones, but their tenacity paid off. Their successful coordination with the beach landings laid the groundwork for expanding the front lines and pushing deeper into occupied France. One of the first major battles following the beach landings was the fight for Corentin. This small town held outsized strategic importance, as its capture would link Utah and Omaha beaches and consolidate the American front, allowing a continuous line of defense and supply. The battle was fierce and drawn out, with intense house-to-house and street fighting. Control of Corentin was contested by determined German forces and increasingly resolute American infantry who understood that the town was the key to turning the initial foothold into a launching point for the broader liberation campaign. This struggle underscored the transition from the chaotic landings to sustained ground combat that would characterize the Normandy campaign for weeks. In contrast to the progress made at some points, the British objective to capture Caen on D-Day was not realized. The city, a crucial hub for transportation and command, was heavily defended and resisted initial assaults fiercely. The failure to seize Caen quickly forced Allied commanders to adjust their plans, and marked the beginning of a prolonged and bloody campaign in the region. Caen would become a focal point of intense fighting for weeks, draining resources and testing the endurance of British and Canadian troops. Its contested status highlighted the complex and costly nature of the campaign beyond the beaches. German forces, battered but still formidable, began to mobilize armored counterattacks to repel the invaders. Notably, the 21st Panzer Division moved against the American beachheads, aiming to slice through and drive the Allies back into the sea. However, their efforts were hampered by a combination of factors. Effective Allied air superiority kept German movements under constant threat from above, while fierce ground resistance slowed their advance. Allied forces, though exhausted and depleted, capitalized on these advantages to blunt the German armored thrusts, preserving the fragile gains made on D-Day. The intensity of these counterattacks demonstrated both the resilience of the German military and the precariousness of the Allied position. The toll on the German army was severe. After hours of intense fighting, German units were stretched thin, suffering from supply shortages and disrupted communications. Command structures were frayed as radio transmissions failed and messengers struggled to move through dangerous terrain. Confusion and exhaustion seeped into the ranks, eroding the cohesion that had once made the Atlantic Wall a formidable barrier. Despite this, German soldiers fought tenaciously, aware that failure here would mean the collapse of their western defenses. The desperate nature of their resistance underscored the stakes for both sides, a brutal contest where the survival of armies and the fate of nations hung in the balance. The day's fighting laid bare the enormous gamble taken by the Allies. Months of planning, deception, and preparation culminated in a day marked by both triumph and tragedy. The complexity of the operation, involving airborne assaults, naval bombardments, and amphibious landings, demanded precision and coordination that the fog of war often obscured. Yet, relentless pressure, adaptability, and sheer determination propelled the invasion forward. Every casualty, every shattered bunker, and every inch of sand gained was part of a broader strategy to break Hitler's grip on Western Europe, a high-stakes endeavor where success came at an unthinkable cost. As night fell, the battered but hopeful Allied forces settled into their tenuous positions. The beaches no longer resembled the smooth, quiet coastline of hours before. Instead, they were transformed into sprawling battlegrounds marked by the scars of intense combat. The men who survived the day's horrors faced new challenges, securing supply lines, fortifying positions, tending to the wounded, and preparing for the inevitable counterattacks that would test their resilience. The initial shock of the landings had given way to the grim reality of prolonged conflict, one that would stretch across weeks and months. In this precarious foothold, the seeds of eventual victory were sown. The hard-fought gains of D-Day opened the door to the liberation of France and the broader collapse of Nazi Europe. Yet the path ahead remained fraught with peril, demanding unyielding courage and sacrifice from the soldiers who now called these beaches home. The first day was over, but the battle for Normandy, and for the future of the continent, had only just begun. The days after June 6, 1944, stretched into a grueling campaign that tested the limits of Allied endurance and resolve. The initial foothold on the beaches of Normandy, precarious though it was, became the launching point for a larger, more complex operation to break the German hold on France. The Allies faced not only a determined enemy but the daunting task of transforming fractured beachheads into a continuous front capable of sustained offensive action. The grim reality of war settled over the once peaceful Norman countryside, as shattered villages, churned fields, and shattered roads became the battleground for a titanic struggle that would shape the course of history. In the immediate aftermath of D-Day, the push inland encountered fierce resistance. The capture of Corentin in late June was critical, connecting Utah and Omaha beaches and allowing the U.S. First and Third Armies to begin operating as a cohesive force. The battle was brutal, house to house, street to street fighting marked by snipers, booby traps, and counterattacks. The Americans, often exhausted and still adjusting to the chaos of the landing, relied on grit and determination to secure the town by June 12, opening vital supply lines and securing routes toward the Cotentin Peninsula. Further east, British and Canadian forces faced their own formidable challenge in the struggle for Caen. Originally slated as a swift objective for D-Day itself, Caen proved to be a stubborn fortress, fiercely defended by the German 12th SS Panzer Division and other elite units. The city became a symbol of the grinding nature of the Normandy campaign. The Battle of Caen, spanning from early June to mid-July, devolved into attritional warfare, with Allied forces launching multiple costly offensives, including Operations Charnwood and Goodwood. Despite severe losses, these battles gradually wore down German defenses, diverting their forces and opening avenues for further advances. One of the most dramatic moments during this period came on July 25, 1944, when the Allied breakout from Normandy began in earnest with Operation Cobra. After weeks of brutal fighting and painstaking advances, the U.S. First Army launched a massive aerial bombardment, leveling German lines south of St. Lo. This assault shattered the German front, allowing American armored divisions to pour through the breach with unprecedented speed. The sudden surge overwhelmed the exhausted and outnumbered German defenders, forcing a rapid retreat and opening the way for a drive toward the Seine River. This breakout marked a decisive shift in the campaign, but the cost remained high. The German army, though battered and retreating, continued to mount fierce delaying actions. The 7th Army and remnants of the 5th Panzer Army conducted fighting withdrawals, attempting to slow the Allied advance and regroup. Communications and supply lines were stretched thin, and the once formidable Atlantic Wall defenses were rendered useless against the mobility and firepower of Allied mechanized units. Throughout June and July, the air war intensified, with Allied air superiority playing a crucial role in the campaign's success. Fighter bombers and heavy bombers relentlessly targeted German supply routes, railroads, and reinforcements. The Luftwaffe, once dominant over Europe, was reduced to fragmented sorties and defensive skirmishes. This dominance in the skies prevented the Germans from mounting coordinated counterattacks and left ground forces increasingly isolated. The psychological impact of the campaign weighed heavily on both sides. For the Allied soldiers, each day was a struggle not only against enemy fire but against exhaustion, fear, and the constant presence of death. The sight of ruined towns, shattered families, and the omnipresent threat of ambush created a grim backdrop to their advance. Letters home spoke of hope mingled with sorrow. Men clung to the belief that each painful step forward brought liberation closer. On the German side, soldiers grappled with dwindling morale as the reality of defeat crept closer. Many were battle-hardened veterans, yet faced with overwhelming odds and fractured command, their resolve was tested in ways few had imagined. As July gave way to August, the momentum continued to build. The Allies pressed forward, their lines expanding and linking with the resistance forces growing within occupied France. The liberation of towns and villages brought fleeting moments of joy and the harsh realities of war's aftermath. Civilians, caught between retreating German troops and advancing Allies, faced reprisals, destruction, and the upheaval of years of occupation. The Normandy campaign, far from a swift liberation, revealed the brutal complexity of modern warfare, where planning and courage met the chaos of battle, terrain, and human endurance. By the end of July, the stage was set for the push beyond Normandy's borders. The sacrifices of June and July had broken the back of German resistance in the region, but the path to Paris and beyond was still fraught with peril and uncertainty. This period between D-Day and the Allied breakout encapsulates the harsh reality behind the triumphant headlines. It was a time marked by grinding combat, tactical adaptation, and a relentless struggle for every mile of ground. The Normandy campaign was no longer just about the beaches but the war of attrition that would ultimately decide the fate of Europe. Every soldier, whether in the rubble of Corentin or the battered streets of Caen, played a part in this historic push to undo the grip of tyranny and restore freedom to a continent scarred by years of conflict. If you want to truly understand the human stories behind the thunder of war, the sacrifices, the strategies, and the moments that changed history, then WW2 Impact is your frontline. Subscribe now and join us as we uncover the untold truths of World War II, bringing history to life with every story. Hit that bell so you never miss a chapter in the fight that shaped our world. Your journey into the impact of war starts here.